This week on The Wheelhouse. Tech and politics. And a little later, artificial intelligence in Connecticut. For Connecticut Public, I'm Frankie Graziano. This is The Wheelhouse, the show that connects politics to the people. We got your weekly dose of politics in Connecticut and beyond right here. Deepfakes, candidate chatbots, AI-generated political ads. These are just three of the ways artificial intelligence is changing how we do politics in the United States. And for the past decade plus, social media platforms like Facebook, they've transformed the way we consume and engage with politics, and each other too, really. Users have been exposed to political echo chambers, misinformation campaigns. We're going to return to the intersection of technology and democracy in a moment, but first, a local news update. A very good friend is joining me in studio. A public hearing recently held in Hartford to debate proposed health insurance rate hikes. Joining us in studio to talk about it to my left is Connecticut Public senior health reporter Sujata Srinivasan. Good morning, Sujata.
Morning, Frankie.
Hey, what happened at this hearing that happened at the Capitol the other day?
A lot. Yesterday, it was about four hours or so. It started off in the morning with protests in front of the legislative building. It was charged, very technical, of course, from the side of the insurers who are asking for rate hikes. This year, they're asking for average increases of 12.4% for individual plans, 14.8% for small group plans. And just to put that in context, there's some data here from the Kaiser Family Foundation, the KFF, as they are now rebranding themselves, and for plans on the health insurance exchanges, the state insurance exchanges nationally. That's the average of about, the ask nationally is about 6% rate hike increase for 2024.
So you're telling me that in Connecticut, I want to underscore this, they're actually talking about a bigger hike than they would nationally outside of the state?
Correct. And the commissioner, and we're talking about the insurance exchange here, but so for plans on those exchanges, and the commissioner did ask, what's driving these costs, and so did everyone, basically, questioning, from Republicans to Democrats and advocates, and the answer came back to utilization is going up, unit costs going up, and then that went down to, what's driving all of this. And the crux of it was Attorney General Tong. He asked for the insurance department to organize a broader hearing that would allow officials to, actually just grill, sort of interrogate these, the hospitals and, all players involved on, what's driving the cost. That request was turned down last year. He made that request again. So that's from Tong. The health advocate Doolittle.
It seems to be like a bipartisan kind of issue here.
Absolutely. I mean, no one can disagree that healthcare costs are going up, and it's affecting, everyone across the political aisle. It's affecting all constituents. We've been sort of bombarded by inflation, wages not going up as much, cost of living, and on top of it, now you have high deductible plans. So so much of it, and a lot of it was emotionally charged. I've got to particularly point out, one of the testimonials that was deeply moving. Isabel Barber, member of the public, voice shaking, tearing up. She says she got a bill of $34,000 for her child who was an inpatient at Middlesex Hospital, and she says she has two insurers. And she asked, she said, "Do you have any kids? Think about it. These are people's lives."
So any idea on whether these costs are going to be adopted? And if so, who's going to be impacted? How much would they pay?
Premiums would go up, and these are the these are the requested rate hikes. And last year, of course, they would be approved, but the question is, to what extent? And Ted Doolittle asked the insurance department to approve the bare minimum to keep insurance companies solvent, but also, keep in mind the burdens of people. So last year, insurers asked for an average increase of 20.4% on individual plans and 14.8% on group policies. And the department approved average increases, but not what they asked, 12.9 and 7.9 on both these plans. So this year, we don't know. There will be an increase, but we really don't know what to expect.
Sujata is going to be watching this, reporting on this for Connecticut Public. Sujata Srinivasan, our senior health reporter, thank you so much for coming on the Wheelhouse this morning.
Pleasure, Frankie.
I want to talk tech, and as if artificial intelligence comes into the spotlight, how is it going to further change our politics? And to help us understand all this, we're joined by three great guests. Justin Hendricks, the co-founder and CEO of the Tech Policy Press. Good morning, Justin.
Good morning.
Ryan Heath, he's the co-author of the Axios AI Plus newsletter. He's focused on all things AI and global trends in tech. Good morning, Ryan.
Good morning.
And then there's Micah Musser, who is the former research analyst at Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology, where he worked on the Cyber AI project. Good morning, Micah.
Good morning. Happy to be here.
Thank you so much for coming on, Micah. And if folks have questions about tech and politics, join the conversation, 888-720-9677. Even if you want a point of clarification, something like that, give us a call this morning. Justin, you're going to get the first question here. Let's start with you. Before we get to all things AI, I want to talk about how technologies like social media have changed how we engage with politics. How have these platforms disrupted politics in the U.S.? Can you give us some kind of specific examples of how social media has impacted past elections, maybe say 2016?
Certainly, and I think a lot of your listeners will have, noticed that things are not all well on the internet. That social media is a environment that is not always a positive one for our interaction with one another. If you look at sort of the last 15 years of kind of growth of these platforms, there's so many different ways in which they've changed the incentive structures for individuals interacting with one another, with politics, with politicians, with the media. And we're only now beginning to sort of get good science on how those interactions work, how those incentives are changing the way our politics work.
And what do they tell us when you're talking about those incentive structures and the good science?
Well, one of the things that folks are most concerned about are issues around polarization, particularly affective polarization. So, the degree to which one group, detests the other, we'll say in simple terms. And, of course, measures of polarization in the U.S. are up over the last several years. And a lot of folks point the finger at social media and look at dynamics on social media and blame it. This is a contested area in social science, computational social science. A lot of folks are working on trying to discern exactly the mechanisms that might drive the interaction between social media and politics, social media and polarization. And there's a lot of good discussion amongst experts about exactly how that works.
And is there any kind of concrete numbers into that effective polarization? You said it's up. Do you have something you could cite in terms of the degree to which people are maybe not liking each other over politics right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, on one level, you can kind of look at the rancorous state of our politics on a regular basis, and you sort of feel it in the way that, parties sort of demonize the other, regard the other as enemy. But there are various measures of polarization. Some that look at affective polarization, some that look at legislative polarization, and all of them essentially have been increasing. The important point here is they've been increasing since before social media was a thing. So it's not the case that social media is the cause of political polarization. It's more the case that it plays some role. It interacts with the different dynamics that are at play.
A lot of doom and gloom potentially surrounding the relationship between social media and politics. Maybe rancor in politics might be a little more accurate, but Has social media had any positive effects on our politics? Are there benefits?
Absolutely. I think no one would argue that there have not been positive benefits of social media in politics, not just in the U.S., of course, but around the world. Certainly, in terms of representation, the ability for voices to cut through, for new individuals to challenge power, to challenge institutions with merely their voice in an account. That certainly had a positive effect. And there's certain sort of political movements, everything from Black Lives Matter on through to other types of movements for liberty and justice that we've seen around the world that have 100% been powered by social media. So the question I think for a lot of folks is, how do you kind of harness that good? How do you kind of take advantage of the social media's driving participation and driving representation, while also being able to potentially manage some of those downside risks?
Mike, I'm going to give you a crack at this next one and help us simple folks out there like me understand this. Artificial intelligence, can you first explain to us what the heck is generative AI?
Sure, I can do my best. So generative AI, I think, broadly refers to any sort of AI application that is used to produce new types of content. The reason this term has become used is because traditionally a lot of AI tools were about sort of data processing or classifying things, making sense of data instead of producing new examples of previously seen data. So now under the category of generative AI, oftentimes we're talking about either models. You may have heard of, some of your listeners may have heard of Midjourney or DALL-E. These are image generative AIs. They take just a text-based prompt from a user, and they can generate oftentimes pretty realistic seeming images of that prompt. And the other broad type of generative AI that's in the news a lot right now is called large language models, or LLMs. These are basically trained to mimic human text. And so in some sense, they oftentimes work as a sort of very, very powerful autocomplete system where if you start talking or asking questions, they will continue the text or interact with you as a chatbot. And so it can be a really cheap way to generate much more human-seeming text than a single human could write in a short amount of time.
You said you'd try your best, so you did a great job there, Micah. Thank you for doing the Lord's work and helping us understand generative AI. Ryan, how does AI influence the way information is shared and received in political discussions?
Extremely difficult to answer because we're still in the early stages of AI. But what we are seeing and what most experts predict is that AI really lowers the cost or the barrier to entry for creating a lot of different types of information and then spreading that or replicating that information at a huge scale. So think about if you are working on a political campaign and you need to come up with some kind of targeted message to voters on each block in your district, or you want to segment the voters according to very specific things that you learned about them from some other consumer data that you bought about them. With AI, you can have 1,000 different personalized messages. You don't have to have that one leaflet. You don't have to cut that one TV ad that everybody will hear. You can really target that information. And if you're acting in good faith, maybe that is just explaining your policy position. But if you want to be a manipulative candidate or some other political committee that really wants to disrupt the election, you could represent false information. You could misrepresent your opponent. And you would be able to get that information out very quickly in ways that could do a lot of damage before any regulator or your opponent might be able to get sight of that, get wind of it, and fight back. So AI can spread a lot of good or bad information very quickly in ways that, would have been impossible or would have cost millions of dollars in the past to create.
Oh, so you say there are bad actors out there. You don't say, Ryan.
Yeah, and there were bad actors before AI, and there'll be bad actors in whatever version of AI we get in the future. So a bit like Justin's point on social media, AI isn't going to be the cause of people behaving badly, but it lets them do it at a speed and scale that we haven't seen before. And one of the fears that I have, and that I think a lot of other people have, is that the tech companies themselves and the election authorities, not just in the US, but around the world, are not really ready to cope with that. They don't have necessarily the expertise. They don't have the numbers of people employed. And there are no laws that are really putting guardrails around that type of behavior because this technology is so new. So we are all going to be in for a wild ride as the primary season kicks off for 2024, and then as we head into the general election campaign.
Buckle up. Your research, Micah, you specifically looked at what role AI can play in disinformation and propaganda campaigns. What'd you find?
Sure. Yeah. So I've done a couple projects about this. The most recent, I was trying to explore the costs of using AI versus human authorship. It seems quite clear. I think that a propagandist who wanted to use AI could generate much more content much more cheaply than relying on human authors. That being said, I also was sort of skeptical. These AI systems are very expensive to train from scratch, and so I do expect malicious actors who want to use them will probably mostly rely on existing AI models instead of training their own. Which may make it a bit easier to track, maybe a bit easier to monitor. So there is some hope on the margin there. I also think it's interesting. One maybe slight note of difference here that I'll just highlight is I'm actually not so concerned about AI being used to hyper target and personalize content. I do, in fact, think one of the trends in politics that social media itself has helped drive is that politics is increasingly national. People basically log on to Facebook or Twitter, they see a bunch of national stories, and then they get really worked up about them. And that trickles down into even local politics, like school board elections are increasingly driven by these national stories. So certainly there is a danger of AI being used to really personalize content. I'm almost more concerned that it creates a sort of fire hose of content, let's call it, where even if everything is about a national story, you could just generate so much noxious content so cheaply that you can dominate even pretty large-scale news cycles. I'll pause there. I just wanted to throw that in maybe as an interesting thought to dwell on about how the exact way this gets used might shake out very differently depending on the topic or depending on the agenda of the person using it.
Ryan, Justin, you want to respond there?
Well, I think that, I understand exactly where Micah's coming from with regard to the kind of nationalization of our politics. And I think that point is kind of well taken. You see that as a phenomenon with various kind of social media controversies becoming kind of the focus of intensely local debate. But, I don't know entirely that I'll agree on the subject of whether AI-generated ads won't kind of create the ability to hyper-target in ways that we haven't seen before. And not just in politics, but, some of your listeners are probably well aware that we're beginning to see a range of different types of fraud that are taking advantage of generative AI as well, using things like synthetic audio and voice. And I suspect that we're going to see more attempts at using these in a political context as well. So I suspect we'll just have to see how it all plays out. Big question is, what will authorities do? We know that, for instance, the Federal Election Commission has a process underway to think about how to regulate generative AI in the use of political ads. So we'll see if perhaps the government decides to take some action and whether that has any effect.
You talked there about the synthetic audio, and there's deep fakes out there. These are images and videos that mimic a real person to spread misinformation. They're one of the most concerning products of AI. It can be virtually indistinguishable from real voices. Take a listen.
America, you blame me for interfering with your democracy, but I don't have to. You are doing it to yourselves.
We're entering an era in which our enemies can make it look like anyone is saying anything at any point in time, even if they would never say those things.
Our great national anthem. Baby shark doo 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 doo, baby shark doo 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 doo, baby shark.
Some are virtually indistinguishable. I don't know if Joe Biden has ever called for Baby Shark to be our national anthem, Micah. But for the ones we can't differentiate, the real versus the fake, how should we deal with such an information environment?
I'll jump in on this. I actually think this is a really interesting question. And earlier when we started talking about generative AI, I sort of said that there's the image side and then there's the text side. And this is an area where I think that distinction becomes really meaningful because you're right. A lot of this audio content, a lot of this images, they're oftentimes, they look very realistic. But the tech is not quite to the point where they're totally indistinguishable. And so oftentimes it's possible to actually tell that something's fake. A common piece of wisdom at this point with AI-generated images is that you look at the number of fingers on a hand, and oftentimes these models still might mess that up. They're getting better, but even if they're not detectable to a human eye, they tend to leave statistical patterns that aren't all that hard to detect. I will say, as a piece of advice to listeners, this voice fraud thing is definitely on the rise. And so in your own life, it is probably important to be very careful if you pick up the phone. It's from an unrecognized number, but it sounds like a loved one and they're asking you to wire money. Don't just do it. You should always hang up, call your loved one directly and confirm it was them. But in the political context, the fact that it is still possible to detect this, we have seen, I think the DeSantis campaign ran an ad where they had used a sort of deep-faked audio of Trump, and that got a lot of negative press attention. I think that there was a fair amount of blowback because it's unclear what the norms are around this tech yet, and it was sort of perceived pretty negatively. I would be more worried with the image and the audio of a sort of election day scenario, where something very misleading gets spread in the day or the week before election day, where there isn't a ton of time to debunk it. You can contrast that with the text-based content, where it's very hard to detect actually when text is generated by an AI system. And so there, I think I'd be much more likely to expect this becomes sort of more embedded in common political practice, either campaigns, foreign propagandists. You see large amounts of content over long periods of time. It doesn't really become as much of a crisis flashpoint type situation.
And Justin, I got to lob one more question for you, and we only got about 30 seconds because we're up against a break. Are there any scenarios in which an AI could positively contribute to this political discourse?
Absolutely. The reality of generative AI is it's another creative tool, another tool for communication. And, I don't think at any point in human history have we said, oh, we're not going to use this new tool to express our ideas or express ourselves or express our creativity. The question is about, how do we think about incorporating it into our information environment in a way that acknowledges some of the risks that Ryan and Micah have discussed, the low cost of developing disinformation, the ability to potentially misrepresent individuals or what they've said in the past. So I think, we as consumers, as civic actors, as citizens, we're going to have to figure this out.
Hoping to get some conversation going after the break. Looking for you to call in 888-720-9677 to join our panelists talking about tech and politics. This is The Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. This is the Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. If you're just joining us, we've been talking about AI's potential impact on politics ahead of the 2024 U.S. presidential election. Still with us, Justin Hendricks. He's the co-founder and CEO of Tech Policy Press. Ryan Heath, he's the co-author of the Axios AI Plus newsletter, focused on all things AI and global trends in tech. And Micah Musser, who is the former research analyst at Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology. And just a reminder, you can join the conversation by calling 888-720-9677, 888-720-WNPR. And what questions you got about technology and politics? Maybe you're like me and you need a little help. Maybe you've been in front of that fire hose of content that one of our guests mentioned in the first segment. If you need some help, give us a call, 888-720-9677. Ryan, I need your help here. Give us some insight on how AI will influence upcoming elections, or at least the thought behind how it could influence upcoming elections.
Yep. I think one of the big trends over the past 10, 20 years has been a real decline in trust in a lot of our institutions. And we can include broadly democracy or specifically our elections among that. And I think while AI is going to be allowed in lots of ways because of America's great freedom of speech opportunities and constitutional protections, I think what we're going to see is people getting a bit overwhelmed and confused by some of the information that is thrown at them. And that's not me saying that people aren't adults who can't cope with different types of information. Of course, we can cope with different types of information. And if we think in terms of AI literacy and we go away and verify news or posts that we see on social media, for most people, things will be fine. But I do think that it's the case that people who want to disrupt the election have a real interest in kind of overwhelming us and making us kind of give up when it becomes too hard to know what is up and what is down, who is right and who is wrong. Some people may just tune it out and not participate in the election. And it's extremely hard to know whether that will mean people do or don't vote at the end of the day. But I do think you'll find a lot of people getting tired through the electoral process. We already feel like elections are nonstop here in the United States. And I think that trend is only going to increase in 2024.
Okay, so a little hope there. We're talking about having some kind of AI literacy and hopefully folks paying attention to the content that comes out there. Justin, how can AI be used in personalizing political ads targeting voters? What are the implications there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that this has been one of the things that experts have been thinking about for a long time, the extent to which generative AI and the ability to hyper-target advertisements would kind of come together. And this will be, I suppose, the first election where that's really possible. And, I had a conversation recently with a range of different folks who work in political communications and in some cases who advise political candidates and parties on how to do this stuff. They're convinced that this will be a kind of standard practice for campaigns in 2024. And we're going to see how it all kind of plays out. I think, to Ryan's point earlier, there's just not enough evidence yet to see exactly what the impact will be. And I think also that Micah's right to, ask the question whether the impact will be as great as perhaps some experts have said it might be. So we'll just have to see. This will be another grand experiment, just as past elections have been with other, technology cycles, with the advent of social media or with, internet video, which was a big deal back in 2008. Every cycle, it seems like we're seeing the impact of a new technology.
Micah, you kind of had a call out there. If you want to jump in on these ads.
Sure. I'll just be brief. I certainly don't expect that they won't become common. I think that I think is a main takeaway for members of the public, is that this is in the same way that 2008 was sort of a watershed for the use of social media at all. 2024 may be a watershed for the use of AI. I think for those of us who are actively researching this or reporting on this, it gets really interesting to think about differences in how exactly it gets used, and what types of of strategies pay off and which ones don't. But the high level takeaway is that, yeah, I certainly don't doubt that these are gonna become part of the new normal, at least in some fashion.
That's exciting to think about 2024 potentially being the watershed moment for AI, or maybe it's not exciting. We'll see. Not trying to keep it all doom and gloom here, but we'll see whether or not that's something to be looking forward. Again, we're talking about personalized political ads targeting voters and the implication. Wondering about the AI-generated campaign video by the Republican National Convention and whether or not those images, that's something that we need to talk about here. What do you think, Justin?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is another example. And I think in this case, the RNC, as I understand it, did disclose the use of AI in the ad, but it was small print. So, many viewers may have missed that. I think that's one of the things that the Federal Election Commission is thinking about, looking at the moment. What are the guidelines? How can perhaps some of this material be tagged or labeled or otherwise kind of disclosed? What are the rules, right? And right now, it's almost like we're seeing some political campaigns sort of test the waters, and we don't have norms yet. We don't know what's acceptable, what's not. Right now, the pressure is perhaps a little bit off. We're not quite in the heat of the campaign season at the moment, but think about October of 2024. What will it be like then?
We've also got to remember that people are grown-ups, which doesn't mean there are not risks here. But for example, when Tina Fey was doing those great takedowns and satirical sort of imitations of Sarah Palin in 2008, we didn't sort of have to write across everything with flashing lights like, hey, this is not Sarah Palin, this is actually a comedian doing this. And I know that there are different examples of that, and things can feel very real and intense when you've got these sort of deep fake images. But it's also about our imagination and also about sort of what the limits of freedom of speech are. So I do think the labeling and the transparency is key. But people are often grown-ups. They know when something is not necessarily a documentary, but is asking you to imagine a future under a potential political candidate. So yes, we're going to have to figure this out, but we have to treat people as grown-ups in the process as well.
And I'm sticking with you here, Ryan. How do you think this will potentially impact voter behavior and perceptions and our trust in our political system?
Yeah, it's really early days. So I think that it creates a bit of an information arms race. It's not that one party or one candidate has this technology and the other doesn't. So I think, generally speaking, from that sort of party and partisan perspective, things are going to come roughly like a draw, but it's going to amp up the intensity and the temperature of a lot of these discussions. So I think that may tire a few people out, but I don't think it's going to give an advantage to one side or one perspective over another. I think it's relatively neutral in that respect.
Conversation. Yeah, go ahead.
I'll jump in briefly there to add to that thought and say one thing that does distinguish this from, say, 2008. In 2008, of course, social media, Facebook was sort of equally accessible to everyone, but the Obama campaign had to invest a lot of upfront costs in actually building out a data analytics capability to make use of Facebook effectively. This wave of generative AI, to the extent that campaigns are using them, they're mostly using models that have already been built, sometimes at great cost, by other parties. Things like ChatGPT, which is owned by OpenAI, things like Midjourney. Once it's already been built by someone else, there's no differential upfront cost to whichever campaign wants to use it. And so to Ryan's point, that's another reason to think that there's a sort of equalization here. There isn't all that much of a first mover advantage that comes from really going heavy on AI early in a campaign cycle.
Frankie, I'll just add
go ahead.
to that it's not just political campaigns and politicians who will enjoy that flattened economics or ease of interface with these generative AI. It's every citizen that wants to log on and give it a go. And that's one of the things that we'll see how that goes in the near term. If you want to employ generative AI tools to run your own political campaign out of your basement, you're welcome to do so.
I'm sticking with you here. The conversation really kind of hitting home to me, the potential of AI to be a danger of our democracy. And first, where are we as a country in addressing these potential problems? And second, I guess, what are some concrete policy recommendations to these issues?
I suppose I can just say that, at the federal level, we have no federal AI legislation. There are dozens of proposed bills in Congress that would address AI in different ways. But I think, given the gridlock we're seeing on Capitol Hill and the fact that we're about to enter into an election cycle, I don't think any seem likely to pass. Your listeners will probably hear about different hearings this fall. Chuck Schumer, in particular, Senate Majority Leader, will have a set of hearings he calls safe innovation framework. So he'll be focused on artificial intelligence and asking questions in particular about its impact on elections. I will say that for your listeners in Connecticut, you have recently passed a few laws that pertain to artificial intelligence. You've got, of course, your Connecticut Data Privacy Act, which is passed, and you've got laws going into effect around,
and this is something we're going to talk about.
Privacy.
Yeah, this is something we're going to talk about in the next segment. And I just got to tell you that we got one last question here, just about a minute left here. And Mike is going to get this question. How can we as individuals become better equipped to navigate the current political discourse, given these newer technologies that we're talking about?
Yeah, it's a big question. So I think that one general lesson is that the provenance of content you see online is more important than ever, which is to say, it matters a lot who or what institutions are sharing news. And again, I think I'll make a sort of distinction here between the images, the audio, the video, these sorts of things that the artifact itself is a truth claim in some sense. If you see a picture, it seems like a claim that something happened. As those get easier to manufacture, I think it becomes more and more important to make sure that they're coming from an authoritative source, and not just believe every image you see online. The flip side of that with text, I think, is that one of the dangers when you talk too much about AI in or even foreign influence in social media is that people begin to tune out not just likely false information, but in fact any argument that they disagree with, they tend to just sort of chalk up to being an attempt to influence them. And so I do think, while it does become more important to sort of vet the provenance of what you see online, it's important at the same time not to fall into the default mindset of anytime you see an argument, especially if it's not a factual claim, if it is just a text, an argument, something that deserves being engaged with, it's important not to just default into the attitude that everyone you disagree with is an AI.
From Connecticut Public Radio, this is The Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. Great conversation we just had with Justin Hendricks, Micah Musser, and Ryan Heath. Thank you so much for joining us on The Wheelhouse this morning, guys.
Thank you.
From Connecticut,
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, from Connecticut Public Radio, The Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. Next up, we're going to look at how Connecticut lawmakers are thinking about artificial intelligence. Stay with us. This is The Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano, and we just heard about the potential impact of artificial intelligence on our national politics. What about on the home front? How are lawmakers thinking about it here in Connecticut? In June, Governor Ned Lamont signed a bill that would govern the use of artificial intelligence in the state. You just heard in the last segment Justin Hendricks talk about Connecticut's ability to kind of regulate the technology industry. That would in part involve developing something called an AI Bill of Rights. So what exactly is that and how would it help? For more on all this, we're joined by someone who's been following this story, Allison Cross, journalist at the Hartford Courant covering government and education in Connecticut. Good morning, Allison. Good to have you back on the Wheelhouse.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Let's start with the big question. Why did Connecticut lawmakers take up the issue of artificial intelligence this session?
I really think it was born out of the privacy bill that came out last year, but it's also important to remember that AI isn't new. It's been on policymakers' radar for a while. I know it's kind of within the last year with ChatGPT and chatbots. That's kind of all people are talking about right now. But that's kind of really when artificial intelligence, I think, became tangible and visible for the everyday person. Things like our voice assistants like Siri and Alexa are AI, algorithms run all of our social media. So this type of technology has been in play in years, and our lawmakers have been keeping an eye on it.
Any lawmaker in particular that kind of pushed that conversation forward this year?
Yes, Senator James Maroney was right at the forefront with all of this legislation.
And is Connecticut alone in this? Is James Maroney kind of a first in here, or do you start to see other states taking on AI?
Yeah, Connecticut's really among the first in the nation to kind of introduce this type of AI oversight. So far, only 14 states and Puerto Rico have enacted AI legislation. And like you heard in the last segment, the federal government, Congress, has been kind of slow to act. So Connecticut's really at the forefront with this.
The target is not the AI chatbots that may evoke these science fiction fears, as you've reported. If not that, then what are we trying to address here?
Yeah, so what we're addressing is specifically government AI systems, kind of what our state agencies use to help speed up decision-making processes. So that's what this AI is focusing on, making sure specifically that our state government isn't discriminating against any citizen in any way when they use these technologies.
Few moving parts of the new law, including the creation of an AI working group, the land of steady task forces. We got an AI task force now. Allison, what's the task force going to do?
Yeah, so the working group, it will recommend best practices for legislation and implementing AI systems in government. And it will also develop an AI Bill of Rights, which isn't a Bill of Rights for artificial intelligence. It's for us as citizens to make sure that we're protected from this technology and that our rights aren't encroached on in any way. So that will likely follow the Biden-Harris administration's AI Bill of Rights blueprint, which just focuses on safe and effective systems, data privacy, making sure that you know when AI is being used and it's explained to you, and again, protecting against discrimination.
The AI Bill of Rights, that's a really interesting concept. What does that actually mean in practice? Will it be similar to, say, the U.S. Bill of Rights?
Yeah, you can kind of think about it along those lines. It's just making sure that that citizens know that this technology is being used on them because it's being used in a number of ways. There was a report from Yale Law School that kind of showed how these systems showed up in a lot of places that you wouldn't expect. And I think the point right now that lawmakers are trying to make is that there's very little that we know about how our state government is using AI. And that's the purpose of this bill, to make sure that citizens know how it's being used, what it's doing, and that sort of thing.
Anything in particular that you think might resonate with Connecticut residents?
Yeah, I think it's just important for people to know that these technologies are being used. I can just discrimination's kind of on everyone's mind, and kind of a example of that is a lot of that police departments often use AI to determine where they will place their patrols. And as we know, historically, communities of color have been over-policed. And if these AI systems are running on data, historical data, discriminatory data, it will just kind of feed that loop of sending officers back into those same communities and perpetuating the cycle of over-policing. That's just one example. But also, AI algorithms also showed up in school lotteries for determining where Hartford students would be placed in open choice schools. It's also used to sort job applications at the state level. So it's really showing up in many ways.
Important use of understanding how AI is being used, particularly by law enforcement. That is very important reporting there, Allison. I appreciate that very much. Now looking forward at the proposed legislation and it's seeking to bring transparency to the use of algorithms in government decision making. Can you give us an example of what that means?
Yeah, so basically, what this legislation does is every year there'll be an inventory of all AI systems that the government uses, and it'll be posted online. The first one's supposed to be completed by the end of this year. And it also ensures that before any agency uses a new algorithm, that they do an impact assessment to make sure that it's not discriminating or impacting groups in different ways. We really think about this technology that it's a computer, it can't discriminate, but when you look at the data that are feeding these systems, everything's fallible. And you need to have this oversight to make sure that rights aren't being taken away.
Less than a minute left before we wrap. How might what's happening in Connecticut kind of influence discussions, even policies about AI regulation and accountability in other states, maybe even on the national level?
Yeah, I know in a recent article from the Associated Press, Senator James Maroney said that Connecticut's likely going to shift their focus to private industry next session. And he shared plans to work with lawmakers from New York, Virginia, Colorado, Minnesota, and a bunch of others this fall to create model AI legislation. So this is definitely the first step of many new bills that we'll see on state level and national level as we learn more and begin to understand more about AI.
There you go, Allison Cross highlighting something Justin Hendricks talking about in the last segment, our national AI panelist, that Connecticut may be starting to lead the way in terms of regulating AI locally. Allison Cross, Hartford Current, thank you so much for joining us this morning on The Wheelhouse.
Thank you.
Today's show, produced by Carol Chen. What a tremendous job she did with this conversation and helping somebody like me understand generative AI. Thank you so much to Meg Dalton for producing today's show as well. Our technical producer, Kat Pastor. And thanks to Tess Terrible for helping us in the studio. Special thanks again to Carol and Stacey Addo for all the work that they've done this year on The Wheelhouse. You can download The Wheelhouse anytime on your favorite podcast app. I'm Frankie Graziano. This is The Wheelhouse. Thank you for listening.